Let me say it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a privilege really to share with you some of the ideas and things that I'm going to be talking about. As you probably know, economists are perhaps the breed of human beings that should not be trusted with some of these complex issues. Actually, at one time, a well-distinguished economist said it's totally unacceptable and a major travesty is to leave issues of development and economics to economists. They always manage to mess up the situation, create major problems. I'll try to see to what extent I can create a bit of chaos and problem. At one time, the story is there was a major conflict between three scientists about which profession is the oldest. And the surgeon said, look, it must be definitely a surgeon, physician, because God out of one rib created Eve. I say, no, wait a minute. It's definitely an engineer, because out of chaos, he was able to generate really all disorder. The economist was laughing. He said, who put chaos there in the first place? So this is really where the things come. One of the issues that I want to talk about is the fact that economists have been trying for years to find that magical wand, that magical key that will open doors to prosperity. What can people, what can nations do, what can regions do to improve the economic performance and their capacity to use scarce resources to meet all these complex, competing, infinite needs of people. The classicists, and you're going to recognize now that some of the things that happened or some of the thoughts that came 250 years ago are still alive today. There was a group of economists known as the classicals. They go to Adam Smith. You probably heard about him, all right? And David Ricardo. Actually, David Ricardo really fits in this place. He was a member of parliament for many years. So what happened is that these classicists, but particularly this Adam Smith, had suggested that all you really need to get the economy to prosper and grow would be for that economy to have a class of capitalists. Because these capitalists, you give them a surplus, they invest it. The capitalists always are not consuming all what they get. The workers, on the other hand, you give them any money, they devour it. If they don't devour it themselves, according to Malthus, they'll have children to devour it. And that ultimately the economy, if you give it a bit of time, all the surplus would be eaten up by the workers as the population grows. And that ultimately the economy would move all the way to that place we call the cusp, or where it becomes stationary. The economy becomes stationary in the sense that output that is growing, but not growing fast because of diminishing returns. Economists have only one law. And that law is that if you keep increasing labor on a fixed amount of land, ultimately the output starts to decline. It cannot grow indefinitely. And Malthus came in and he said, the trouble is that anytime you have a surplus, because this is the amount of wages that you pay workers. And this amount, output over what you pay the workers, you get invested by these capitalists and keeps going until the population grows and eats it up. And then famine and pestilence would constrain the economy. But the only way it would grow is to have that capitalist class taking that surplus and investing it. And then the story became a little bit more difficult in the sense that people said, well, what about technical change? What about technology? All right, why should the economy always go to subsistence level? He says, well, it goes subsistence level because every time you get a surplus and they have capitalists fighting and competing to get workers, they bid the wages up, but you workers being so stupid, you get more children, you eat up all the surplus. So to blame anybody for the lack of progress is because workers and population growth always devours whatever surplus is. Then comes the guys, called Colbert. In some sense or the other, I'm going to suggest that maybe there is some parallel between Colbert and Mr. Trump, because they have really almost similar ideas. Colbert had been a prime minister in France, and the whole construct was such that there is a fixed amount of gold, and you grow and you get wealthy only relative to others. And if gold is fixed, if you get more gold, then the others will have less. And the only way you get more gold would be to export more and import less. So Colbert went in and put tariffs on steel and no. But the story that is crucial here is that the way you grow is to make others grow less than you. And they were unable to conceive of an economy that was growing so that it have more of anything. They had a very static view of how the economy works, and it's all gold, and I get more, then you get less. It didn't last long. Then came the Marxists. Marx really came in, he says, I'm going to make Adam Smith sit right. And what Adam Smith and Mauser said is that workers are stupid and they devour all the surplus. And Marx said, no, they're not stupid at all. They're just exploited. That every worker works a certain amount of time, say 10 hours. She needs 6 hours to meet all her needs. Capitalists, they take the surplus value, which is the hours of value, labor's work that does not go or cannot appropriated by labor. And the story is very interesting here. All of a sudden, the classical economists were basically talking about a very rudimentary economy. Marx came to talk that the way capitalists compete with one another is by bringing technology in. And why do they bring technology in? Because as they compete with one another for labor, they bid the prices of labor up, labor becomes expensive, you bring the machines in. And you compete with others. Ultimately, what happens is that this drive and competition, you throw people out of the market, you corner the market, and in this drive to competition, you create the industrial reserve army. And this is the army of the unemployed who were unable to retain their jobs as capitalists compete to cut costs and corner the market. And then the system breaks. Why does it break? Because of its productivity. You have so much production, but you don't have income because workers are unable to find jobs. The system breaks down. There is a glut in the market. And the story then is to a great extent one in which technology is necessary. The only way you really create wealth is through technology, but then technology that replaces labor ultimately will fall down. Why does it fall down? Because it creates so much unemployment and that people are no longer getting the income that could buy the extra, the increased output that a productive technology would bring about. And he had another system which was interesting. He says the only way an economy is in equilibrium or balance if the superstructure and the infrastructure are consistent. The infrastructure is the force of production, all right, is the technology. The superstructure are the values. It's the institutions. As long as institutions and technology are commensurate, consistent, the system is in equilibrium. He said when you started from a communal system of agriculture, where everybody owned in common land, and you all consumed as a tribe together, the institution of common property and the technology of common production was consistent. You found now all of a sudden private property because they found the new plow. All of a sudden now, production is private, but consumption is common. And then the system all of a sudden was inconsistent because the consistency between the structure, the suprastructure was communal, but the technology is private. It broke down. And from it came out a situation where the capitalist sprung up. And how did the capitalist came by? It's because of the steam engine, because of the factory system. But factory system is common. You have collective structures of production, whereas property is owned by the capitalist. So you have now a technology which is social and the values are private. The system breaks. The proletariat would have nothing to lose but their chains. They ultimately rebel and they create the dictatorship proletariat. But all of this has about three elements that's interesting for us. An economy that depends on technology and does not have a system where it distributes wealth in a more appropriate way ultimately will break down. And does not break down because of any lethargy or because of some backwardness. Actually, it breaks down because it's too productive. Because that increased production is not distributed in any equitable way, and then you have very high levels of production, but very limited means to buy it, and the system breaks down. But now, all of a sudden, we got to the point where the classicists thought how great this capitalist is going to be. You just have to trust the capitalist. I mean, till now, we're still doing things. What should we do? We should have a tax system where we distribute money to the rich, because the poor always devour it in consumption. It's only the rich will get that surplus, they invest it, and we go forward. Even today, I mean, old stories, but the same has not changed. The other one that came from Marx is that you always have to bring technology. Without technology, there is no chance of increasing the wealth. But that increase in the wealth that does not have a social system that is commensurate, consistent with it, where it distributes it in such a way that people can buy all the goods and services they're producing, it's going to go down. And here comes Schumpeter. Schumpeter was teaching at Harvard. He's an economic historian. He says, look, the classicists had it wrong, and so did Marx. Nobody was right. That's life among the economists. They're always right, the rest are completely wrong, okay? He said what really was missed by Marx and by Smith, it's not the capitalist that does the thing. Because the capitalist probably is more interested in consumption, luxuries and things. And technology does not just come by itself. I mean, the way Marx dealt with it as if technology really is something outside the system. Schumpeter said, look, what you really need are entrepreneurs. What drives the system, the key to development, is the capacity to groom a class of entrepreneurs. And the entrepreneur is different than the capitalist. Most of the entrepreneurs never had money of their own. And they don't have any scientific knowledge. They don't need to be scientific or inventors. So the entrepreneur is not a person with money and not a person with science. But what the entrepreneur is a risk taker, is one that can exploit an opportunity. They are the forces that bring the inventions from the shelves of the professors and the scientists into the cash register in the market. What counts is not invention. What counts is not a surplus, but the capacity of a class of dynamic people who are able to take all these scientific discoveries and inventions and bring them into special products and new markets and new techniques that propel the economy forward. And the trouble with Schumpeter, like the rest of the economists, I don't know, they must be a gloomy lot. Okay, he came in and he says, yeah, this really happens fantastically well when the entrepreneur comes in. They come in, they create things, they get lots of profits, but profits becomes a major attraction for imitators. They all swarm in to imitate the entrepreneur and the new inventions, and then large number of inventors will bring the system down. Because imitation will completely devour any profits, and the system goes down. And he coined this term that the development is not a stable and friendly system. He called it creative destruction. That the only way you really move forward is to destroy the past and to bring in its place a dynamic future and a new, vigorant and vibrant development. But it would not last long, because all these imitators take the new inventions and bring an end to the system. So no matter where you start, with the Adam Smith, you got Malthus. The population increase gets everything. With Marx, it's the workers rebel and break down the system. With Schumpeter, it's the imitators who come in and destroy whatever has been brought new as they come and use the system. So it's always a story of one or the other. Now came some new guys, and this is really important for us in Northwest Territories. A guy called Nurkse, Ragnar Nurkse, I think is a Swede, all right? And a guy from America, Rosenstein, Rodan. And they said, look, we can't depend on the entrepreneur, because the entrepreneur is interested in profits. And sometimes development or the ability to industrialize and to grow fast and to put these new structures, the entrepreneur is too small, too trivial. They could really create small things, but they cannot deal with major things. When you're talking about a region or you're talking about a nation, then what you really need is the capacity to develop many complementary activities at the same time. Because the entrepreneur will create one industry here and one small industry there. The story is that there is not a single entrepreneur that could command such large resources, massive amounts, that a development would require. The industrialization is not a haphazard or a random process. It requires a lot of planning and coordination, and you cannot depend and you cannot rely on the entrepreneur to bring it. So what we really need is this coordinated plan and this coordinated capacity to bring many industries together. Because if you bring one industry, you get a bit of growth, and then it might fizzle out. But he gives the example of the shoe factory. If you bring only a shoe factory, everybody that gets to work in the shoe factory will have money. Some of them will buy shoes and growth. But you see, if you only get shoes, you don't really get the leather, and if you don't really get a machinery industry at the same time, then the production of shoes that requires machinery may not find the machinery. And if you really go into machinery, you better, at the same time, lay down the grounds for a steel industry. So the story is that to the extent that industries are interconnected, and to the extent that there are requirements to couple a large number of industries together, if you don't couple these industries together and tightly coordinate and simultaneously allow them to grow, they will ultimately fall. So industrialization requires complementarities being exploited, requires massive investment being made simultaneously. It means that you really have to have several industries all at the same time. And this, therefore, cannot be something taken or undertaken by entrepreneurs. There is only one institution in the economy that can do it. And who is this institution? Who do you think is this institution? This is massive things. It has to be le gouvernement, the government. You cannot expect entrepreneurs or capitalists. You really need a major effort, a coordinated effort, a planning effort, and that is ultimately, exclusively, the outcome that comes from decision making by the public sector. And many people said, well, that's really great. Look at Germany, what it did. All right, it brought steel and machinery and weapons and everything together. If you didn't have Bismarck, couldn't have allowed Germany to grow unless all these activities happened at the same time and coordinated in time, and massive amount of investment was directed because Bismarck made sure all the bank finance was basically going to industry. So you really needed this massive effort, this coordinated effort, but in many countries that tried it didn't work. You see? And they knew, because you want simultaneously to create all these complementary investments, but where are you going to get all these managerial skills being built? One of the major failures of industrialization in many countries, whether it's in Argentina or many other areas, including India, did not succeed because the investment grew faster than they were able to train and to educate and to prepare the class that could manage and could coordinate all these things, either as as managers at the government level or managers at the industry level. And here comes the German school. This is really interesting. Much of the analysis that came from Ragnar Nurkse and from Rosenstein, Rodan, is that you really cannot grow unless you increase productivity, and you cannot increase productivity unless you industrialize, and you cannot industrialize unless you undertake a massive social project that could coordinate all these things. And the German school came exactly along the same lines. Actually, at some times, you would find the German historical school, and the guy who really led this is Friedrich List. And Friedrich List is the one that is known to have advanced the argument of infant industry. All right, he says, look, industries don't grow by themselves. Just like infants, they need somebody to nurture them, feed them, prepare them, and protect them. And if any time you allow industry that's just infant to compete against more mature industry, the battle is always won by the mature. So the only way countries can come as newcomers into the industrialization experience, they have, and they should, and they must protect their fledgling industries. It's only when these industries become mature and able to stand on their feet and then can compete on equal ground, they will never succeed. And some of the statements were very poetic. They don't move automatically nations from farming, because you see, it used to be always considered that nations always passed from agrarian states into industrial states, and then they go into the services. They don't do that. That progression never happens in a random way. You don't go from agriculture into industry automatically. It would take huge effort to do it. You could have all these separate merchants, little economic agents doing things. They never coalesce into a critical mass that is required, for industrialization. This is a little bit small, I know, but the story that is important here is that there is really something very interesting. I read a little bit. Can you read it or read it with you a bit? The lessons of history justify our opposition to the assertion that states reach economic maturity more rapidly if left to their own devices. Anyone who's arguing that only small agents and competition is going to lead to the development of power and progress, they are not learning anything in history. That these don't happen in a random process. A study of the various branches of manufacture, and really these people have identified progress with the progression to manufacturing. That if you look at an economy and you don't see much manufacturing, that economy is never going to have the capacity to stand on its feet and to compete on the international market in a way that will give it a place under the sun. That the only way this could happen is that if you have manufacturing. It may be by chance that leads certain individuals to a particular place to foster the expansion of an industry that was once small and insignificant. Just as seeds blown by chance by the wind may sometimes grow into big trees. But the growth of industries is a process. Industrialization is not a haphazard, is not a random occurrence. It's a process. Industrialization is a process. And the growth of industries is a process that can take hundreds of years to complete. And one should not ascribe to sheer chance what a nation has achieved through its laws and institutions. In England, Edward III created manufacture of woolen cloth, and Elizabeth founded the mercantile marine. All right, so the story here is that industrialization is a process. Manufacturing is the basis of success. You cannot depend on entrepreneurs, the private sector, or small collective decisions, that there is only one way you could bring manufacturing in, and this should really come under the guide and the concern and the nurture and the promotion of a government that's able to coordinate these investments. And there was interesting things that came also from List, that if you leave market forces to their own devices, I mean, remember, Schumpeter was arguing, my God, you should give the entrepreneur full hand, right? Do entrepreneurs spring up randomly, or is there a process? But till now, we have not been able to solve this. There's some guy called McLennan who wrote a book saying Achieving Society. He went asking countries all around the world that had nurtured some entrepreneurs, how did you do it? And he came up with the conclusion that entrepreneurs is not an endowment, that they could be grown. You see, is it nurture or nature? All right? And the argument of McLennan was that it is nurture. You cannot depend on nature to bring it. But then people said, all right, how on earth the United States had all these entrepreneurs? From Eli Whitney, okay, J.P. Morgan, John Paul Getty, so the story is very clear that these entrepreneurs happen to be all Americans. How come? Where were they in Britain? How come France did not do it? What was so special about America to create a class of entrepreneurs that other societies have not been able to grow them as fast or as well or as massively as this? Is there anything about the American system that created this entrepreneurs? Versus the McLennan one, who has been arguing, no, it's not that you're endowed with these things, it must be nurtured. And therefore, it's not that the American fertile soil, or the water they have, or the beautiful, trees in Tennessee. No, it must be something about the system. And these came back and said, oh, it must be the cult of a hero in the U.S. Like, there was a joke about this American and Canadian fishing lobsters in Maine, and the Canadian will take a lobster and throw it into a barrel. The American will take it, opens the barrel, puts it in, locks it, and he tells the Canadian, he said, this animal has claws, it can run away. And it's valuable. Why are you throwing it like this? He said, don't worry, he's a Canadian lobster. If he tries to break out, there will be 30 pulling him down. but this, I don't want to be facetious, but I mean, to some extent, you see, we have a completely different system. In a way that the Americans exalt the hero. I taught at Purdue, and one of my students was a great football player. At the time, I didn't have a clue football player. Because we probably heard about him. Bob Greasy, did anyone remember this guy? He was Miami Dolphin, his son played for Denver Broncos. I mean, the guy, my student, every time I ask him a question, I love to ask my students questions. Maybe I should ask you a few. And then all the guys and girls would shuffle their feet like, geez, why aren't they so concerned? Every time I look at him, they start murmuring things. And I asked him, I said, who are you? He said, no, I'm just the president of my fraternity. He didn't want me to know because I was the only stupid professor who didn't know who the heck he was. And he really liked that. Amazing. I walked with him one time to his fraternity. I would swear to anything. Every student who was walking by had swarmed just to say hello. I worked with a very good, nice number of football players in Canada. I didn't see that all right. But there is something fundamental with all this story. It is the extent to which we exalt the hero, we build these entrepreneurs, we give them that leverage. All right, look, ultimately, somebody with money with no brains, we made him president. But the story that is so crucial is that competition may be good if it kills off the inefficient. And it cleanses the system. But there are more important things than just competition. Just as this really came up to a nice conclusion. The tree that bears the fruit is of greater value than the fruit itself. Right? That's a very interesting, wise thing. The propensity of prosperity of the nation is not greater the proportion in which it has amassed wealth, but in the proportion in which it has more developed its power to produce and create. That if you increase the amount of fish, you have lots to eat at one time. But if you really increase the capacity of people to fish, and you teach them how to fish, it's a capacity that will continue to produce fish to you over the years. And that was really the issue here, is that we don't have to make consumption the ultimate end of economic progress, but that it should, to a great extent, be the capacity of people, their knowledge, their productivity, their dexterity, their knowledge, their skills that are ultimately the real difference between one economy and the other. Okay. Then comes this guy, Rosenstein. Have you heard of Rosenstein? W. Rosenstein? He was the security advisor for Lyndon B. Johnson. He was his economic advisor and he became the national security advisor. And Rosenstein had a very interesting proposition. He said, I looked over all history. I found that the nations that made it had some ingredients that were very distinctive to that nation. And that this story about development and progress is open to all nations. The road to progress is an open road. And any nation, regardless from where it starts, if it brings these changes and these ingredients, it will always grow and prosper. And he said it's very simple. Every nation passes through 5 stages. The first stage is the traditional stage. Every society began in a traditional form. And the tradition of society is one in which, am I going forward or backward? No, forward, all right? They need to go through these 5 stages. And it all began, and it all begins by developing a service. He said, if you are a society and consume everything you produce,
you never have a surplus to invest. And a society that does not have a surplus to invest will never grow. The surest, most guaranteed way to grow is the ability to invest. And if a nation does not have sufficient savings that will increase the resources available to expand future production, if they eat everything they make, there will be nothing left to invest. And what really matters is that you really prepare the economy for takeoff. So you are in that traditional state, and the traditional state is characterized by very rigid social political system. There is very limited surplus that is created. There is no diminishing returns, and the only way you can take off, and he has the stage of takeoff, that you are just crawling, but for development you need to take off. And the only way you're going to take off is to increase the proportion of savings that would create resources or provide resources for a dynamic class of investors who would make the economy grow by building capacity. But you don't grow like what Rosenstein, Rodan, and Nurkse told you. Don't believe you can or should ever create that all-out plan of coordinated things. All you really need is a successful leading sector. So what you really need is to save, to have a surplus, to move from the traditional state, to open the society so that it jettisons all traditional things. Notice this. I mean, the parable here, the picture, the allegory, the parable is that you are taking off like a plane. And the only way you're going to take off is that if you have fuel. And what's the fuel? Is that saving. But you also have to have lightweight. And what lightweight, and how can you create lightweight? Which is a little bit, a bit sinister, is you have to jettison the past. That any society that remains wedded and clings to its tradition and its history is not likely to be able to fly. Because it will have dead weight that will immeasurize it, that will hold it back, would not allow it to grow and to prosper. So the only way you're going to prosper is to have that fuel. You also have the good pilot. The good pilot being that leading sector. That if you look at every single economy, and if you look at what really constituted their takeoff and their success, you're going to find always that sector. Say in the United States, if you don't know what it is, it's the railroads. It's the canals. Because the railroad needed machinery. At every single remote station, they needed a class of people who could fix it if it were to stall. All of a sudden, the American economy was able to create machinery and repair and skilled people who were able to keep that wheel moving. And that became a transferable skill that allowed it to grow and to continue to grow. But you needed that leading sector. And that leading sector is the one that you really need to nurture and need to groom and need to exploit. All right, you could look at Northwest Territories, all right, you have the diamonds. But what have you done in diamonds that is transferable? Where is the surplus we get it from diamond that we could invest it in the economy? So the issue here is investment, a good leading sector, but also the ability to have a good pilot to take it. But we have to also jettison the past, jettison all these systems and organizations that hold us back. Some people say, well, in some sense, this may not really be true. To a great extent, many people say development had only come when nations did not lose their bearing. But it's very crucial to maintain our bearings and to grow knowing exactly where we went from one position to another. This person is saying, no, you're gonna have to kick off all the bearings, throw it away. all this history is nothing but dead weight that holds you back, that constrain you from taking off and go. And then the guy was saying that, what you have to go, you're going to get into, this is a traditional society, from being in subsistence and being in using limited technology. He recognized too that a leading sector that does not bring in new technology will be of limited value. So you don't only need to have a good pilot, you have to have a good plane. You have to have a good engine. Right? To a great extent, this person was literally using the parable or the allegory or the example of a plane as a major description of what constitutes a viable economy. You have to really also move away from the centralized political system. He said that centralization imposes a straitjacket on the economy. You have to liberate it. And one way of liberating it was to create multiple centers of power. Because if you have one center of power, it may become too big and unrestrained and unproductive. The next one is that trade-off, you need an external demand. Remember, look, the man is saying you need an external demand for what? For raw materials. I mean, this is something that may resonate here. Does it or does it not? But you have that raw material. There's no society apparently, and he studied history in a number of societies, not a single experience of development that did not have enough raw materials. Some people took him up and said, what did Japan have? Maybe it had fish. All right, but the story that but the story that is so crucial is that societies that really have made it have always been able to relate their development to a natural resource that they were able to exploit. And that societies that did not or have not been able to avail themselves of the natural resources that they could develop did not do it as well. They also have to have widespread enhanced investment in the physical environment to expand production like irrigation, canals, railroads and others. That if you have markets that remain distant, what is the biggest economic problem here? I asked, our friends who were with me, come on guy, why are you sitting there? Why not you join us? They all had come up, remoteness. All right? There are free spaces. But the story that is so crucial here is that remoteness is a problem. I mean, you need, as one of the major ingredients of takeoff, is to integrate, is to tie together, to dismantle remoteness by trying to weave all the connectivities. These need not really be roads, not even airplanes. Increasingly we use fiber optics, but these are necessary ingredients into weaving together, coordinated, integrated, and coupling all the spaces. Today our competitors are no longer thousands of miles away, they're a click away. But you have to have that click, you have to have that infrastructure that allows it. You have to increase the spread of technology and the advancing existing technology. Look, they're laying very heavy emphasis on technology. And there is no economic development or prosperity that has not been related to technology. Anyone who really believes that you guys are going to bring, those who do not believe in technology are going to bring any progress, technology has always been at the heart, at the root of most of the progress made in any economic history episode. You have to go also and change the social structure. You really need the social structure in the sense you want to create greater social mobility. If you really get your best brains only those who are looking like you or your cousins or your tribe, then no chance is going to be there. You have to open up the system. And that merit should replace any of these traditional values. And that the more you emphasize merit, the greater the chances you're going to take. Right? Then the next system, you have to have urbanization, right? all these hinterlands have to really be integrated. You have to get a secondary goods producing thing. See, if you only depend on primary goods, if you only depend on mining, if you only depend on oil and gas and gold and diamonds, forget it. There should be secondary activities. And the extent to which you can develop this secondary activities, the greater our chances. Now I'm speaking as Rosenstein. If you ask me, you may be able to jump from this, but you need to get nodes, what we call growth poles. In Porter's Harvard guy, you have to have clusters. You have to have the competitive edges, but you need to create these clusters of progress, these growth poles, okay? These nodes of advancement, these centers of excellence. So an economy that does not have centers of excellence, nodes of distinction, poles of growth, are societies that would remain mired in limited progress and in reproducing without much change in the past. But you need basically a new, it could be a new product then, because the green technology, green technology. But what is so important here is to get a revolution of sorts. But it happened agreement to be the industrial revolution, it could be the technology revolution, the information revolution, the computer information economy, the knowledge-based economy. But what you need is a transformation, and a transformation capacity within the economy. And then it goes into the drive to maturity, and you never get a mature economy without diversification. So any society, any economy that remains deficient in terms of being able to create a large number of activities and a diversified economy will never reach maturity. Maturity is synonymous with creating diversification. Remember, I'm not saying anything about your case. Any reference or closeness to what's happening here is only accidental. Tongue in cheek. All right, we go to mass consumption. I don't want to. Don't worry about the math. I'm not going to have any quizzes or anything. But let me tell you, two guys came in with incredible insights. One of them was Roy Harrod from Cambridge, and the other one was F.C. Domer from MIT. And these people said, look, the trouble with all these theories that went before us is that they were partial. They never completed the system. They didn't cross all the T's and dot all the I's. All what counts for an economy to grow is to create a right balance between a surplus, which is saving, and technology. Because if you look, everything I talked about, I either talked about surplus or I talked about technology. The issue is how to weave technology and the surplus together. Harrod and Domer brought them together and said ultimately the rate of change of income, which is growth, is depending on the depends on the saving ratio divided by technology. So you could grow very fast if you save a lot. And you could grow fast even when your saving is low if your capital is productive. So a society that does not target to improve its technology or to raise its savings is a society that will be condemned to remain in a stagnant situation. That the vigor of a society or an economy is the way you balance and you integrate your surplus with your technology. You could have all the surplus you want, but no productive capital, you have low growth. If you have all the capital technology, but you don't have a surplus to invest and expand your economy, you're not going to do it. And then came Solon and another guy, Swan. I mean, this is typical of all economics. A poor guy called Swan developed the model, and then came Robert Solow from MIT. He said he never saw the work of Swan, but it's the same model. But anyway, so what we say, they collaborated without collaboration. It's a Swan-Solow model, but the story of the Swan-Solow model is very interesting. What counts and what drives an economy to progress, to growth, to vigor, is the ratio of capital per worker. That if you look all over the world and look at what societies are more advanced than others, and societies that are growing faster than others, you will find no other variable more important than the ratio of capital to labor, the amount of machinery and technology per worker. The ability of a society to create capital and to spread it over labor and to habilitate and educate and train labor to use this technology, the greater is its chances to grow. So look at everything else. Who cares about saving? Only to the extent that the saving is used to create capital, that you could spread it, use it, complement labor. It's only then that you could possibly have development. And that's the smart soul. And if anybody likes math, here it is. Okay? But the issue here is your ability to grow faster than your population, and it's there. Now, two things were observed by Romer. Romer is this guy from Yale. He just came in recently, and he's basically coming on the heel of the knowledge-based economy. He said, look, we have two empirical evidence. Empirical evidence and economists sometimes don't work as well, but I mean, this man says, look at history, look at the empirical evidence. We have two things we observe. One is that growth seems to continue. Because everything I've shown you before, including that, if I go back, I'll show you. You see this guy, ultimately, you get to a stationary state when your saving is not growing to increase your capital by more than your population, you stagnate. But you notice every single system I talked to you about, Adam Smith through Malthus, Schumpeter through imitation, Marx through exploitation, they all have come ultimately to a state of entropy. Oh, we stop, we don't go. All right? This guy, Roma, came in and said, the story is a little bit different. We observe that growth can continue. Look, from 1900 onward, the economies have been growing. There is no sign or no tendency that has been observed that these societies have come to a stagnating state. Okay? It did not come to stagnancy. Actually, he says, what we really find in the Hamiltonian model, that countries with similar rates of population will ultimately come to a stationary state and a steady state of growth where the capital per labor is growing at the same time in a similar way everywhere. Says, do you really see countries all converging to the same rate of growth? Is India growing the same way, maybe faster? What about really Egypt? It's not doing well at all. If you look at Nigeria, it's actually going backward. There are lots of experiences that are varied and there is no convergence. So anybody or a model that you use to describe the way the economies move that predicts that things are going to converge.
Cool.
I didn't shoot anybody. They didn't really grow all to a stationary state and did not all come to a position where they're all growing at the same rate. Actually, he showed that output per worker growth seems to grow and continues to grow. And actually, countries that have shown high rates of growth continue to be richer, and countries who really are poor remain poor. And the difference between the two continue almost indefinitely. Why is growth continuing in these countries? And how come is it not exhibiting diminishing returns? He said because growth based on knowledge will never exhibit diminishing returns. The more you use knowledge, it grows. Right? Knowledge doesn't depreciate. The more you use it, the more it grows. And to the extent that you have been able to make the transition from being dependent on resources to being dependent on knowledge, then you're anchoring the growth on a capacity that does not diminish. And that any society that would like to really continue to grow all it has to do would be to restructure its activities to increase the infusion of knowledge in these activities. Those who depend on physical capital, those who depend on natural resources are bound to ultimately face the diminishing returns. Those who depend on knowledge, those who have been able to create and to improve creativity and dexterity, they never would face this. Then a small economist, a great one in my view, but nobody has heard about maybe. Have you heard of Herman Daly? You did. All right, that's good. Oh, I'm glad. All right, Herman Daly said something very, very astute. He says, those who argue that knowledge will continue to grow and there will be no diminishing returns are suggesting that you could bake a cake with the recipe order. Wow. All right? I mean, it's a simple statement, but a very profound one, which says that to a great extent, those who really believe knowledge is not to be complemented with resources and that it could be decoupled and could substitute for resources, that's not really in the case. To the extent that we use resources and we have to use both, then there is really always the forces within the economy that would constrain its vigor and development. Well, I could speak forever on this, but I want to come to the real question. Are resources a blessing or a curse? I mean, this is not relevant to every place in the world. If there is any relevance to this question, it's here. All right? Are resources a curse or a blessing? And there is debate, I mean, as you know, economists, they love debate. I mean, you probably heard the story about economists. You could lay them from one end to the other, they never agree on anything. Right? But it maybe it's a bit of an exaggeration, but there is a bit of an agreement here, even among those who disagree, that resources are necessary. If you don't have resources, you may be able to grow, but if you have resources, you could possibly grow and could grow faster than those without resources. The issue is, what do you have to do with these resources? The issue is not the existence of resources as much as what you can do with these resources. How do you use these resources? In what way do you use them? And many economists have noticed that those who depend on resources have not done as well. They may have really some wealth, but have never been able to translate it into continuous growth of income. Right? The Saudis have lots of wealth. You could buy any yacht or any painting in the world, but to what extent have they been able to create that industry that will continue to grow and to produce more and more goods? And they found out that those who depended on agriculture and resources have always suffered a terms of trade dilemma. Terms of trade is what you sell versus what you buy. If you sell agricultural products, they notice, and you buy manufactured goods, agricultural products continuously suffer decline prices, and the prices of manufactured goods continuously increase. There was an economist called Raul Prebisch in Latin America who said third world countries that remain mired and are pushed into improving their agriculture are bound to completely face demise. Because what really matters is your ability to produce these goods that have an increasing chance of increasing value. Agriculture continues. Why? Because of the nature of what we call elasticity in economics, sensitivity to price. If you have food, is there any substitute for food? I mean, unless you can really live on Coca-Cola. Where is a friend of mine? Okay, but the story that is so crucial here is the demand for food is price inelastic. If you increase production, the prices go down, but the value is less, right? Any economist, first-year economics would tell you that if you produce a commodity that has low price elasticity, your productivity would make you poorer, not richer. Whereas the demand for manufactured goods is price elastic. And when it's price elastic, if you increase production, the price goes down, the quantity demanded of it will increase by more than the price decline. Total revenue proceeds that come from it would rise. So any society wired to resources that have very low elasticities are likely to suffer compared to societies that target to produce manufactured goods, processed goods, knowledge-based goods that are not price heavy. All right? The other thing which is also important is that increasingly you need to export more and more of your resources to get the same amount of revenue. And that's not really a good formula or a good state to be in. Now, what people also notice that if you have resources and these resources start rising in price, it's not good either. So if the prices go down, you're really in trouble. But what they really found, that if they start rising in price, it's also a problem. And this problem comes from two sources. One is called the resource movement effect, and the other one is spending effect. What is the resource movement effect? That if resources start to rise, like oil, diamond, whatever it is, all of a sudden you want to move everything to capitalize on that rise in price. And if this is the case, there is no incentive to diversify. On the contrary, the incentive would be to accentuate your dependence on this winner resource that is increasing in price. Two, they notice that the increase in price starts to absorb the talents, the skills. One of the major issues in Alberta that we found, and those who really looked at it when the price of oil went up, is that it literally was absorbing all the brain power, all the skills, all the great ingenuity into the resource sector and away from industry knowledge and things. It also creates an abnormality. Resource going up in price increases the rent. And there are lots of forces and social groups who begin to seek what is known in economics, the rent seekers. They go after the rent. These people would like to really be close to the societies or to the governments or to the group that have the wealth. These people who could have really been more productive in other activities are now denying the society and the nation of their talents because they are focusing increasingly all their attention and all their resources to skimming the surplus rather than producing surplus. All right? It's known as rent seekers. The person who really made this great things is Ann Kruger, a great economist, was the head of the World Bank. The other aspect is, and we've seen this in Canada, we've seen it every place where there are resources. It started really in, the example is usually, the example used most is usually that of Holland. In the Second World War, they discovered natural gas. During the war, natural gas prices went up very fast. What happened? Within 3-4 years, Holland, that used to be a major agrarian and highly productive agriculture and industry, lost its agriculture and industry because it depended so heavily on the revenues it's getting from the natural resources. And why did they lose the industry? Because what happened is that they were selling all this natural gas. They brought lots of foreign exchange. The guilder, which is their currency, appreciated in value. They were unable to compete anymore because their exports became more expensive and their imports became so cheap. They were flooded with imports that undermined and destroyed the nascent domestic production. We saw it in Alberta. Saw it in Canada. When the price of oil was rising so fast, what happened to the Canadian value, the Canadian dollar value? What happened to the Canadian value? There was one-to-one correspondence between the price of oil and the value of the Canadian dollar. And to a great extent, as the prices of oil reached the $120, the $130, our Canadian dollar became larger and higher in value than the US dollar. It was 106 at one time. It fetched 106 US dollars. And under such circumstances, the chances of Canada being able to compete and to increase its capacity of production was compromised. This is known as the Dutch disease, you probably heard. But the Dutch disease is only a simple disease, not as contagious as another disease that we saw it in the Gulf and other areas, particularly Saudi Arabia. The dependence on oil and Brent from these created several dysfunctions. It severed the relationship between consumption and production. You see, now when we really have a appreciated Canadian dollar, everything we buy from outside becomes cheap. Right? Cross-border shopping in Ontario was a phenomenon that really sapped into the energy of Canada, as people found it much easier and simpler and paid to cross the border, buy things with the highly valued Canadian dollars than to buy the Canadian products. Right? It severed the relationship between effort and return. Many people really did not want to really go and work things. They preferred to work in the public sector. Bureaucracy is bloated. The government was getting all this money from the resource rent. They're paying all these economists a lot of money, they're not worth it. And all of a sudden, what you don't laugh. But the story that is so crucial and true, this is not, I'm imagining these things, there was a major decoupling of effort and return. You cannot have an advancing society where people are paid by being close to the emir, to the prince, or to the prime minister, than being more productive. There is no way an advancing society can prosper if its resources are moving into the resource sector, or what you can do with the resource sector instead of producing the knowledge-based economy. Okay? So all these things are part and parcel of this Dutch disease. It also, people say, why should we save? All right? I mean, what we really found in Canada and found in many countries and many areas where there are really huge wealth increases, the incentive to save declines. If you feel richer, why would you have to save? At one time, just a few years back, Canada has the dubious distinction of having the lowest saving rate among the OECD countries. And one of the reasons I'm willing to submit and suggest was that feeling that we have this oil and it's going up in price and we're getting richer, that really undermined the incentive, the propensity to save. We also go to a great extent, and we find most countries that depend on resources ultimately to engage in, I call it moral hazard, by borrowing like crazy. There isn't a single country that experienced a major increase in its wealth that did not mortgage this wealth in many respects and engaged in large, huge debt that raised the ratio of debt to GDP in a fundamental way. So all these things are literally issues that really undermines the capacity of society to create what I call the hard budget constraints. Hard budget constraints. Hard constraints where people have to make choices. When you feel that you're rich and there are lacks or laxity in the economy, you lose fiscal discipline. You lose macroeconomic discipline. And if you lose these things, then you lose the capacity to oversee, to overgear, and to allow for very rational and more important decisions in the way you allocate resources. Oh, I'm rich, if I lose here, that's fine. But when you really become very conscious about every dollar and never really surrender that discipline and the need to make sure that every resource you have to be used to the best use, then you get that laxity. That laxity has always been highly correlated, associated in a way that it may, to some extent, be considered to be a major and a very tightly connected manifestation of the Dutch disease. Now, they said also East governance. I didn't see it here. I don't think I have seen it in Canada, but in many countries you've seen it. Okay, think of this. If the ruler, and many of the societies, resources go directly to the government, not to the people. In some areas they think that anything on the ground is for people. Anything below or above is for God. And God is represented by the king. Or think so. Okay? But what's happening is that most of these resources, wealth, are going into the hands of government. There is a manifestation, there is a very negative consequence to this. You all know that you cannot have democracy unless the ruled pay taxes to the ruler, and the ruler is bound and is held accountable to the ruler. In many of these countries, because the ruler is so rich, gets all the wealth and money without being dependent on the rule, that leader has been totally liberated from any accountability to the people. We have seen it in many countries, that rich resources have watered down, have diminished, have diluted the democratic tendencies as it severed the relationship between representation and taxation. So in many respects, there are many issues that any resource-based development has to be concerned. I've seen articles also, just a new one just came in and said, no, we didn't see any of these things you're talking about. None of these negative things. Actually, if you don't have resources, you don't have that surplus, even Adam Smith would have told you you couldn't do anything. But there are real, major warnings, okay, red flags that should fly. That any society that depends on resources has always to be careful to see to what extent have they diversified. If you find that the economy has not diversified sufficiently, write it to the resources. It has to really be a situation in which the fiscal discipline should remain tight and overall. If you find any fiscal laxity, write it to the resources. If you find that there is any governance issues and rent-seeking behavior, write it to the resources. I think I said too much negative things. Let me say some positive things. All right? And then have I spoken too long? The positive things that I would like to say is that the beauty that you have here that other countries don't have is that you can bring a change. No matter how you think you are an old economy, an old society, you're still new, you're still fresh. The opportunities are there. And there is really here a sort of a challenge that many others cannot meet it. You have really the resources. And by the way, you have resource you haven't talked about, and which in my view is going to be the most expensive resource in the world, and I call this water. All right? But the story is, to what extent are we preparing ourselves or preparing our people in a way that we shift the source of wealth from something that's non-renewable into something renewable. And I think the real challenge and the real issue here is the extent and the speed with which all the new society can make and rise up to the challenges and increase the share of the knowledge economy, the activities that depend more on people's abilities and less on resources. I think I'll stop here.